practice based in London. I'm not going to go into it any great extent, but we've been working in the residential sector now for 41 years, and we've got a whole raft of experience. I'm probably going to talk more broadly about sort of exemplars and some of the sort of issues and problems that we have to deal with at the moment. So the first one of those is, so I've got the list here, landscape sustainability and placemaking. I'm sure there's going to be a load of overlap, and some of the overlap will be buildings we've worked on together, which is fantastic. So in terms of landscape, not necessarily about how we design it, but how we use landscape and how precious it is in terms of ensuring that we are able to make the most out of the space that we have available. So I'm going to talk about Accordia to start with. I think I've got 4 projects, 20 minutes. The first 2 projects both built around 2008. And it was seen at the time when sort of we were appointed by Countryside that there was an opportunity to sort of rewrite some of the story about how we make places and design our homes. So Accordia is out on the western side of Cambridge. It's an old government building site, and it sat in a mature landscape. I suppose in terms of the master plan, what we felt was really important is actually a collaboration, not just with other architects, which we did collaborate with, but also the landscape architects. It was Andrew Grant's associates who worked with us to develop this master plan. And unusually for these sorts of drawings, they've got very big trees, but the trees are actually that big. What we were able to do was work with the existing grain to create a sort of really coherent structure, which defined these very simple routes through the site. And I think hopefully you'll agree that within that there are these very large open spaces. And it's kind of set the sort of benchmark in terms of what's now referred to as the London vernacular, which is both good and bad for us, because in a way it's become perhaps overused, but what it does do is it establishes a kind of normality, a kind of building structure which defines routes and creates places for people to live and prosper. So the diagram we've got here, this is one of Keith Bradley, the Bradley in Feilden, Clegg, Bradley. So what we came up with was this idea of these rugs within a sort of carpet of landscape. But the rugs themselves are actually much tighter, much denser than perhaps all the guidance would suggest that you have today. But what that does is then actually greater value to the landscape between the buildings, the landscape that most people experience and share. And in order to achieve that, for each of the homes, what we wanted to do was to create their own gardens, not tacked onto the edge of the building or to the back of the building, but within the sort of 3-dimensional building form. And so there was this idea of gardens on a number of levels. And so it's a very simple diagram here of the shared space that we were talking about in between these rugs. There's kind of living space at the ground floor, a sitting area, and a bedroom area, but all had their own garden spaces. Now, this is very generous as a proposition, and in some ways that's why I'm saying it's a bit of an exemplar. But I think there are lots of threads that we can borrow from in terms of informing our new attitude towards what buildings can be and how close they can be together. So this is sort of just quick set of plans, bringing the cars into the plot and having kind of perhaps a sort of rather utilitarian experience at the ground floor with a living space. And as you move up towards the bedrooms, each of those open out onto sort of a generous terrace. And here is just some images which illustrate how that would look. So what's it like to be in these spaces? And so I've just got a couple of slides here really to show that although there's a sort of great they're in close proximity, the buildings, there's a sense of intimacy, light, and especially as you move further up the buildings, that actually become wonderful places to be with amazing views across the site. And here's just quite interesting shots showing the sort of 3-dimensional nature of those spaces, but all held within the confines of the plot. So we've got some quite nice models here which show that whilst you have those spaces at different levels, actually within the centre of that space you've got this wonderful environment which is car-free as well to commune, I suppose. And so then there's just the two slides. This is one which we saw right at the beginning, the spaces between, places for people to contemplate, to meet other people, and also more importantly than that, I suppose, places which are safe where children can play. And so that's kind of just one of the buildings, looking at how important the landscape is and working with the existing trees. So there are amazing plane tree in the middle there, which we retained. Just another very short little presentation, I suppose, but looking at how simple buildings can be from the outside in terms of placemaking, but then looking at potentially moving away from the corridor scheme, the ubiquitous corridor scheme, which is a little bit too long and a little bit too dark. And so this is Merton Abbey Mills in South London. This is a little commercial quarter adjacent to the River Wandle. And the site is just these sort of cluster of buildings, and we have the river running down here. Sort of pretty straightforward buildings, but what you can see is there's a great big skylight that runs the length of each of those. And here's the plan for those who can quickly read that. So we have what would otherwise be a normal corridor scheme, but pulling them apart and letting light down. It works for about 4 stories. Because after that you don't get the natural light. So on the left here we have these sort of placemaking exteriors, and then on the right hand side we have these interiors which are full of light, and actually you can have living spaces which look into that, which would otherwise just have sort of a single aspect. So you can address issues of ventilation, but also creating a sense of community within those buildings. So we think it's quite, again, a sort of a nice exemplar. And as I was saying, the buildings themselves then actually lend themselves to placemaking rather than being an object building. And so this is the exterior as it relates to the river, creating a really nice environment for people to wander past and enjoy the bank. Right, so the next one, sustainability, which I'm going to do instead of Glenn today. We tossed a coin and I unfortunately ended up with that story. So, as I said, we've been around as a practice for 40 years, and Peter Clegg has been at the forefront of sustainable design for all of that period and before. And so there's a sort of story that runs through that in terms of our understanding of passive solar energy, in terms of natural ventilation and solar, one planet living, which I'll come on to in a minute, and then net zero carbon. There's a lot to talk about. I'm not going to go into any detail, but I think that one of the things that is important is that these are all becoming very familiar now. And what we've chosen as a practice is to follow the one planet living principles. And I think it's actually just a really nice way of understanding what struggle we have in terms of addressing the problems that us humans have generated. So what's one planet living? So at the moment, and you may have all heard this before, but many of the developed countries use resources which is more than one planet can sustain. So in the UK, some of us use 3, a lot of us use a bit more, and some of us use a bit less, but on average it's about 3. There are some countries which use 5 or 6, and that's offset against the developing countries which, fortunately for us at the moment, aren't using all of that up, but they will do, and so we need to address that. And so what the idea of the one planet living is just to identify how we use energy, where we source our materials from, and our lifestyles to sort of just balance out how we can improve the planet and move towards a one planet living economy. And so one planet living is set out in this instance in 10 points, which starts up at the top there with health and happiness and ends up at the bottom there with zero carbon. It's not a metric, so there's no numbers that go with it. It's about prioritising, finding sites, and then saying what's the thing that we should focus on and how can we best address these particular issues which affect the way that we use the planet. Some of them are much more complicated to address than others, but it's actually a really good consultation tool and a really good way of testing how your building works and communicating that with clients, but also with the communities in which you're designing. So we were fortunate enough to work with a client, Bioregional Quintain, who did a joint venture with Crest Nicholson to develop a site right next to the station in Brighton. It's 172 homes, actually really in some ways quite simple, but in terms of the story behind it, it's quite complicated. But it's trying to address all of those 10 points. I'm not going to, probably won't capture all of them, but generally what we've got here is a composition of ideas in terms of transport and why the site and how the site can work properly. So we've got national transport on one side, local on the other, in between our building, how we move around. There was this is 2008, so it's very similar to the period that we were designing Accordia, but it addresses all the issues of transportation. Car clubs, at the time, these weren't heard of. It was expected we'd have 3 stories of car parking. We managed to rid ourselves of all of those, bar I think about 5 accessible. The building itself at the time, we had a wood chip boiler, which still is in operation, recycling and composting as well. Now, all of those things are in some ways very ordinary, but actually as part of the community, it was an opportunity to educate people about how they lived and operated. And we had we have a green caretaker who educates people about how they use their buildings. This is quite a relatively old building, so the technologies that we've got in there, lots of people will have heard of, but at the time they were brand new. Heat recovery vent systems, but actually just tying into thinking about the orientation of buildings, how light gets into the corridors, how you create communal spaces, and the fabric of the building itself. We looked at having buildings with high thermal mass, and the advantage of that, it holds onto the heat, so you don't need to be pumping heat into the building all the time. We had the interiors and exteriors were breathable, so it's actually a natural way of looking at the building fabric. And the building blocks themselves are light clay, so actually used very little embodied energy. So this was quite early on, and this is kind of still, I think, very relevant to where we are today. The plan itself is very simple. The New England Street, a very simple terrace of buildings, and a route up through the middle to the station and to the green routes which ran out of Brighton. Just a series of diagrams looking at one aspect of what we were trying to do in terms of overheating, which is an issue in new buildings, but also sunlight and daylight, and creating delight not just outside the building and within the landscape, but also within the buildings and sort of generating communities. So the diagram at the top is what is the kind of ubiquitous corridor that we were talking about that runs from one end to the other. What we did was we broke that up. It's actually quite a large number of units, which we wouldn't get away with today. But actually, in breaking it up, we provide views out. We provide ventilation into the corridor. And then what we also then did, because the QS wanted us to, is put some more units back. And in doing that, we were able to provide decks at every single landing to sort of reinforce a sense of community, not just at the community use space at the bottom, but also throughout the building and also on the roof itself. And then coming on to the other uses, it's quite a nice proper mixed-use development. There's a community use, commercial uses, where we had the ethical property company who ran the office spaces at an affordable rent. And so in a sense, it was a kind of a living, working community. And then just a series of slides looking at how that works. One of the issues, I suppose, we also have, coming back to the land issue, is density. So this is actually quite a dense building, but actually in terms of its orientation, sunlight and daylight, this has been very successful. And this is just a shot of one of these corridors. looking down, the corridor opens up and closes down, and then it opens out onto these spaces at every level. And the green caretaker would then curate how these spaces could be used. It was also one of the first buildings to have allotments on the roof. We're using the Bokashi composter, and for those who listen to Gardener's Question Time, Bob Flowerdew did a few programs up there, but we were never allowed to take any photographs of ourselves with him. I found one. I didn't know who he was either. Anyway, so this is just one of the last slides looking at how that sort of green corridor runs through adjacent to the railway. Right, so those two aspects about how we use land and sustainability obviously come together in probably one of the most important themes that we'll both be focusing on, which is placemaking. As with the story about carbon, just before we went into lockdown, we had an exhibition in our office called Carbon Counts, and became kind of the sort of kickstarter for Architects Declare in terms of the climate emergency. And we had an exhibition, but also we've had other exhibitions which are sort of, in a sense, looking at and articulating what issues around sustainability are, but also other sort of broader issues. What is, how do we make places? What makes a good place? What are the good buildings and good homes that form those spaces? And so this is part of it. It's just one slide from an exhibition about all of the elements, I suppose, or some of the elements that come together to successfully defining places. So the building the site and development in terms of the brief for this evening's talk of multi-house developments is multi-home developments is in Kirkstall Forge, which is just north of Leeds. A development by CEG, about 350 homes. But it's actually really quite an amazing opportunity that we were able to latch into, and our sort of responsibility, I suppose, to turn it from just a ribbon development into a really good sense of community and place. So this is the landscape as it was just before they got going, and you can see there's an existing railway line that runs through the site. And they then established a railway station there, and all of a sudden that kind of unlocked the whole story in terms of how people could use this existing environment to create and claim it as a place to live. So just looking further afield, there's sort of amazing landscape, amazing river, places to visit from sort of the historic and industrial heritage of that area. And it's something that we felt strongly that not just focusing internally, but actually looking beyond the site was opportunities to define this as a really interesting destination and place for someone to live. So I think one of the key things with developments, and we often look back in terms of the history of the site, the existing forges that were there, and what was the legacy of this space, and what were the opportunities. So it's sort of an incredibly hard environment, but places where people came together and worked and lived. And lots of those people still, there's a sort of resonance in terms of their understanding of that sense of place. And I think that's quite important, that whilst we might imagine that actually that wholesale redevelopment is appropriate, there's always the memory of how people operated in these areas. So in a similar way, I suppose this is slightly out of focus, but in terms of things like Accordia, the idea of just creating very simple streets which take you from one place to the other, not car dominated, but then opening up to places beyond. It's just a couple of model shots looking at what the opportunities were on the site. We've got the railway, obviously, which opens up to its broader context. We have the sort of larger, higher density buildings, which actually makes this a viable proposition, but also the uses, which I'll come on to in a minute. And then as we move down towards the river, the scale drops and the placemaking, I suppose, begins. Obviously, key to all of these developments is creating a coherence a sense of order, of scale, and so within that there are obviously this placemaking which is the ordering principle around which the homes are developed. So this was what was referred to as the stitch, where people would link through to the existing neighbourhoods, where the cafes and other use classes were placed, but people also lived as well. So actually it became a sort of potentially an extended experience, a sort of not necessarily a 24-hour experience, but throughout the day there was places to visit. So in terms of the site itself, how it was broken down, and looking at the ingredients of that development. So we've got housing, but actually that goes hand in hand with apartments, with affordability. We've got a primary school there, the commercial, retail, leisure, and as I was saying, those spaces around which we order those uses. And so there's just a series of diagrams then that look at basically taking this sort of warp and the weft of the site, the journey along the river and along the railway, and where the buildings are located, but this sort of very strong axis that runs through there that ties together the landscape on either side. So there's a sort of need to define a sense of place, not just one, but a series of places, sort of major and minor notes. So we've got places, but also the spaces, and the spaces can work with or against that or along that. So we have this sort of wonderful valley park and the woodland on the other side of the river. And then finally within that, actually having defined a set of parameters, the homes and the houses can be placed, and the diversity of those types. So we have not only different types of houses, but different tenures as well, which is key to creating a sort of sustainable community. And then, as I was saying, that we were lucky enough that we've got Kirkstall Forge railway station, which has located itself here, or has been developed here, the first of the office buildings, and then coming back to the sort of the sense that rather than reinforcing the opportunity for driving around, actually having bikes, which is, again, something which is becoming more and more mainstream. And then the places that then sustain it, the spaces between the buildings, which are actually in many respects more important than the buildings themselves. And then this is looking at this sort of, there's places to play, and then there's places to visit, and then the places to live. And then this is just a sort of a final few slides looking at the housing typologies, which again make reference to some of the ideas in the previous schemes, where we have a covered mews through the centre, which actually locates the parking, which makes this a non-car dominated development, and but it also then we allow ourselves that intensity in terms of the location of buildings one to another, and the streets that are developed around that, which actually I think are much more natural, rather than a series of wide boulevards where we can have our cars end on end. Actually, this is just, we've got a few disabled spots, but actually making these delightful routes that run through, connecting one space and one place to another. And again, the diagram, which is similar to Accordia, where we bring the cars off the streets, and then using the topography to have a greater and a more immediate relationship to the landscape around it. And then just the final slide, which is looking at how that river development might manifest itself. And then in summary, I think that whilst all of those ingredients I think that we were talking about in terms of placemaking have found themselves here, this is only a couple of years out, beyond the point where it gained planning. But actually already a lot of the story about sustainability is overtaking us. So where it says there's no MVHR, there will be. All of those things are going to be pulled into this site to make it not just a socially sustainable environment, looking at the social value which we offer within this, but also in terms of the environmental context. So I've finished there. I'm going to hand over to Glenn now.